Hello everyone, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Today I'm going to be providing an update into my research on the diet and behavior of coyotes in southwest Saskatchewan. Just before we get started with that, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement to the many Indigenous peoples who traditionally lived on and continue to provide stewardship to the areas where my research took place. So grasslands once covered almost half of the Earth's surface and were inhabited by large predators like wolves and grizzly bears. But nowadays, most grasslands have been plowed, with native grazers like bison, pronghorn, and elk being replaced by cattle, and larger predators being replaced by smaller predators like the coyote. Remaining grasslands in Canada are home to several species at risk, like the black-tailed prairie dog and sage grouse, many of which require active management to regain stability. Since most native grasslands are now used for livestock grazing, the role that ranchers play in grassland stewardship is crucial to the survival of these species. Across North America, reductions in large predators have led to the rapid expansion of mesopredator populations, including coyotes, foxes, and skunks, which have greater potential to impact prey species and interact negatively with humans. Anthropogenic subsidies, such as cattle boneyards on ranch land, can sustain predator populations beyond their natural numbers and endanger alternative prey through apparent competition, which occurs when a predator population is supported by a prey species, which results in increased predation on another prey species. To approach this system of coyotes, cattle, and native prey in southwest Saskatchewan, I first used Scats to determine what coyotes were eating during winter and how geographic variation in potential food sources affected their diet. I then conducted observations on cattle pastures to determine how coyotes behave when near cattle and how cattle respond to the presence of coyotes. I conducted this research in the Greater Grasslands National Park ecosystem, including the West Block and surrounding ranchland. Like many other grasslands, this ecosystem contains critical habitat for many species at risk, and coyotes are the top predator. Inside the park, there is a bison enclosure and several prairie dog colonies. Several species of wild ungulates, including deer, also live in this region. As background for my work on coyote diet during winter, access to cattle carrion can affect both coyote diet and behavior. Coyotes will travel long distances to access carrion and may remain near cattle boneyards while large amounts of carrion remain available. Wolves with access to boneyards travel less than wolves without access to boneyards and may hunt less native prey. Previous work in Grasslands National Park showed that cattle made up over a third of the estimated mammalian biomass of coyotes throughout the year, which, according to local knowledge, is primarily obtained as carrion. Coyote scats containing prairie dog remains were usually within half a kilometer of a prairie dog colony, while those containing cattle were distributed throughout the park, but typically further from prairie dog colonies, suggesting that access to cattle carrion could be affecting coyote diet and travel behavior in this region as well, with some individuals specializing on cattle and others on native prey and displaying territorial behaviors. If many coyotes are accessing cattle carcasses from nearby ranchlands, the coyote population could be sustained at the detriment of species at risk that could become prey items. Based on this knowledge, I investigated whether geographic variation in cattle boneyards, the bison enclosure, and prairie dog colonies affect the consumption of livestock compared to native prey, and whether species at risk are present in the diet of coyotes. To investigate coyote diet, a research assistant collected 890 scats along a predetermined route in Grasslands National Park and surrounding ranchland from December to March 2022. I prepared homogenized subsamples from 564 of these scats with the help of a research assistant and sent them to the Canadian Centre for DNA Barcoding in Guelph. The predator of origin and consumed vertebrate prey were identified to the genus level by identifying a region of the mitochondrial COI gene. For each scat collected, the location was recorded, which I used to create mapping layers in ArcGIS. These maps also included the location of homesteads, which are likely to have boneyards nearby, the location of prairie dog colonies, park boundaries, and the bison enclosure. I used these layers to measure the distance of each scat to these geographic features. Turning to the results, I received 202 scats back from the Guelph lab that met quality control measures, were identified as canis, so I assumed were deposited by a coyote, and contained another identification which I assumed had been consumed. This analysis indicated that deer was the most frequently detected prey item in scats, followed by cattle. And this map shows the distribution of coyote scats containing cattle or deer compared to the location of prairie dog towns and homesteads. So here, cattle scat is shown in the larger red dots, deer in the larger black dots, homesteads in the smaller black dots, largely around the periphery of the park, and then prairie dog colonies in these darker orangey brown patches throughout the park. This next slide shows where I was most likely to find scat containing cattle. Scats containing cattle were more likely to be near boneyards as predicted. So as you can see on the graph, for all three of our lines, don't worry about the color of the line for now, but for all three of the lines, when we're closest to the 0 on the x-axis, so there's a lower distance to homesteads, there's a higher percentage probability of scats containing cattle for all three of those lines shown on the graph. Scats containing cattle were also closer to the bison enclosure, which I did not predict. This graph shows that scat found within 1 kilometer of the bison enclosure, as shown by the red line, was much more likely to contain cattle than scat that was further away, as shown by the blue and green lines. I suspect this is due to a high number of homesteads near the bison enclosure rather than an attraction of coyotes that have consumed cattle to the bison enclosure. Here we can see that scats containing deer were more likely to be further from both boneyards and the bison enclosure, which we can see on these graphs. So on the x-axis, we have the distance from homesteads or the bison enclosure, and toward the right of each graph at those higher distances from homesteads or the bison enclosure, we can see that the percentage probability of scats containing deer increases. There was no effect of prairie dog colonies on scats containing either deer or cattle. Other than deer and cattle, coyotes consumed a lot of vole and sciurids, which is the family that includes prairie dogs and ground squirrels, but not a lot of species at risk. I did find it interesting that several scats contained ground nesting avian prey. Although the species I detected in the scat are not at risk, many ground nesting birds in southwest Saskatchewan are at risk and migrate south during the winter. So it's possible that coyotes consume more and a greater variety of ground nesting birds through spring to fall. In summary, coyotes mostly consumed deer during the winter, but consumed considerable amounts of cattle as well and moose. And the spatial distribution of cattle and deer scats suggested that different coyotes may be consuming cattle versus deer. However, this distribution could also have occurred if individual coyotes consumed both species, but at different times and locations. Moving into my observations, wild ungulates and Richardson's ground squirrels, which are both commonly consumed by coyotes, frequently overlap with cattle. But reports of depredation, which is the predation of livestock, by coyotes in the Greater Grasslands National Park ecosystem are not uncommon. Further, defensive behavior of livestock can interrupt coyote attacks, but in some species, the process of domestication has been shown to reduce wariness towards predators. Understanding how coyotes use cattle pastures could be important to the tolerance that ranchers have toward coyotes and the prevention of depredation. And so, with this in mind, I was led to conduct observations of coyotes during spring and summer to assess why coyotes spend time on cattle pastures and near cattle, and how cattle respond to the presence of coyotes. During the summer of 2022, I spent 158 hours watching coyotes on cattle pastures over a 12-week period from mid-May until mid-August. I conducted continuous or focal observations of individual coyotes, and rather than marking coyotes, I observed the first individual that I saw during an observation session. Once per minute, I recorded the activity of the coyote I was watching as travel, rest, hunt, eat, or other. If the coyote was hunting, I recorded the species of prey and any escalation of the behavior to an approach, pursuit, or capture within each 1 minute interval. I used the estimated body lengths of animals and the distances between fence posts to estimate the distance between coyotes and cattle. And when coyotes came within 10 meters of cattle, I recorded the number of times a cow or calf chased the focal coyote I was watching. So on this graph, we have the percentage of focal observations which contained coyotes hunting or eating various potential prey species. And what you can see is that when coyotes did hunt prey, it was typically of ground squirrels, which they hunted more commonly than they hunted native ungulates and interacted with cattle or scavenged cattle. However, coyotes did show some interest in cattle. Throughout the course of observations, coyotes approached a calf twice, rushed cow-calf herds twice, scavenged cattle carcasses 5 times, and harassed a cow for access to its afterbirth once. These findings support the prediction that coyotes use cattle pastures to obtain direct benefits from cattle, at least to a limited extent. However, given the infrequency of these events, I obtained no evidence that coyotes are traveling to cattle pastures because of the direct benefits of live cattle or their byproducts as a food source. Coyotes may instead travel to cattle pastures to access native prey or carcasses, which has been well established in the literature. On this next graph, we have the percentage of their time that coyotes spent at different distances from cattle in the 2 colors of green and yellow at different times of day. So on the x-axis, we have hours after sunrise on the left and hours before sunset on the right. And what we can see here is that coyotes spent quite a bit of time near cattle throughout the day. They were significantly more likely to be within 100 meters of cattle, shown in light green, than further away, and actually spent about 40% of their time within 10 meters of cattle, shown in the darker green. Importantly, my vantage points did include a lot of space, and cattle only occupied a small portion of a field at a given time, meaning that coyotes did have the opportunity to be at different distances from cattle, as is indicated on the graph by the times that coyotes were more than 100 meters from cattle, shown in yellow. This next graph shows the percentage of focal observations that contained a hunt in blue, pursuit in orange, or capture in black of Richardson's ground squirrels by coyotes at different distances from cattle. So on the x-axis, when coyotes were within 100 meters of cattle, more than 100 meters from cattle, or on the far right, when cattle were not visible in the area from the vantage point. As we saw earlier, coyotes devoted most of their hunting efforts to ground squirrels. And even though this graph makes it appear that coyotes experienced more hunts, pursuits, and captures of ground squirrels when near cattle, there was no statistical difference in the frequency of hunts at any distance from cattle. And so, whether the coyotes' association with cattle and not simply cattle pastures is related to opportunities to hunt ground squirrels requires further investigation. I did find evidence that cattle show anti-predator behavior toward coyotes. Cows and or calves chased coyotes in 43% of 21 focal observations when coyotes were within 10 meters from cattle, including the 2 cases in which coyotes approached a calf. Cows appeared to be more likely to chase coyotes from June 26th to July 9th, but I did not detect a significant relationship between cow chases and the date, nor calf chases and the date. And this might be due to a lack of statistical power resulting from small samples of encounters for certain time periods. Interestingly, I also observed a lot of coyote to coyote aggression in this system, which could be related to depredation or to coyote social structures. In the summary, coyotes devoted most of their hunting time to Richardson's ground squirrels and were often near cattle when hunting ground squirrels. But coyotes also scavenged from cattle carcasses and occasionally approached calves, rushed herds, or harassed cows for afterbirth, and cows often chased coyotes that they encountered. My data suggests that coyotes primarily use cattle pastures to obtain benefits from native prey. However, periodic opportunities to scavenge cattle or hunt calves may contribute to their use of cattle pastures. This research could be extended with more detailed molecular work. Identification of individuals could link individual diet to travel behavior, but not to behavior near cattle. Deployment of radio collars could provide information on movement behaviors, which could be used to assess whether coyotes are traveling to cattle pastures at times when ground squirrels are available, and also to link observed individuals with their diets to address whether the same individuals spend time near cattle, and consume native prey. Information from this work on how commonly cattle as an anthropogenic subsidy is being consumed will help to determine the impact of cattle consumption on the diet and ranging behavior of coyotes in this population. And understanding the typical behavior of coyotes when in the presence of cattle, as in my observations, is the first step to understanding conditions that may lead to depredation. If many individual coyotes are regularly consuming cattle, the coyote population could be sustained at the detriment of native prey species and competitive predators like the swift fox. Increased coyote presence could also lead to increased nuisance behavior on ranch land. With this in mind, preventing predator access to carcasses could make homesteads and other areas less attractive to coyotes and other predators, and may be an important step to develop an effective method of controlling coyote populations. With that, I'd like to thank the many individuals and organizations without whom this work would not be possible, and also thank you for listening.